So, a gift from Sweden for you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I can introduce Heather R. Hayes of Heather R. Hayes Associates. Heather is an internationally recognised clinical interventionist. She's also has her master's in education and is a licensed counsellor. As somebody who travels and hears and goes to a lot of conferences, it's been my pleasure to get to know Heather over the years and to learn more about her and her team. They travel the world. Some of their interventions are incredible. We are lucky. Our families are lucky. Our young children are lucky because as a team, they are also able to advise on young kids and adolescents, as well as the family members. In her spare time, of which she has not much, but when she does, the FBI and the SWAT teams in which areas of
Southeast.
It's mainly the southeast. She volunteers as a psychological profiler. So, which I still can't get over. I still am like, oh my goodness. But it's a pleasure to have you here today. And with that, I'm going to go again so that we can get on with the presentation. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you. Thank you. So it is an honor and a privilege to be here speaking in Sweden. I have some good friends here, and I'm just really, really grateful. So good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal journey from addict to interventionist, and then I'm going to talk some about hostage negotiation and terrorism in the negotiation field. And then I'm going to tie that into what I see today as one of the biggest terrorists that face us, which is addiction. So this is a new way that I start my talk. There was a time early on in my career I would not have stood on a stage and said what I'm about to say. So I am an educational consultant. I'm a licensed therapist. I am an interventionist. I am an internationally certified hostage negotiator. I'm an equestrian. And I'm a person in long-term recovery. And what that means is that on February 24th of this month, I will have not had a drink or a drug for 36 consecutive years. And it's been important for me to talk about my own and out myself as a person in recovery to help break stigma. Because this is what addiction looks like. Having been sober for almost 36 years, obviously I got sober young. So the majority of my addiction was that of an adolescent young adult. I got sober at 21 years old. And I can clearly tell you that by the time I was probably 16, which is part of why I really appreciated your slides on adolescent addiction, by the time I was 16, I was full into my addiction. And I didn't get sober until I was 21. I went off to college at the University of Georgia and somehow thought that maybe if I studied psychology, that would help me quit drinking and doing so many drugs. And I guess in some ways it did. I ended up in treatment, but it took me a little bit of time. I remember when I was in one of my first psychology classes, and they put up on the board this long list of questions. And it started out, it said, do you ever drink more than you intended to? And I said, yeah. Do you ever black out and not remember what happened? Yeah. Do you ever go out, do you ever do things that you regret or mortified about that aren't really who you are when you're drinking? Yeah. I went through this list of like 30 questions, and I had like 26 right. And when I got to the bottom of the list, it said, if you said yes to 2 or more of these, you probably have a problem. If you said yes to 3 or more, you definitely have an alcohol or drug problem. And my thought as an addict was that I wanted to take the test over again because they didn't tell me what it said at the bottom, and I might have had different answers. So I wish I could tell you that was my aha moment, but it wasn't. There I am. That's what I studied when I was at school. So I had a lot more car accidents, bad feeling of myself. I actually, when I got to college, I went to the wrong class for half the semester. When I went in to take my exam, I don't know about anyone here who's in recovery, I was a little bit entitled, a little bit self-centered, so I thought I was going to help the professor out and let him know that he'd put the wrong number on the test. And so when I went up and explained that to him, he let me know that he knew where he was, that I, on the other hand, was one who was quite confused. But what I can tell you about this young woman right here is that I came from a very good family. My grandfather was a United States Senator and a very well-known newspaper publisher in the States. My uncle was the Latin American correspondent for the Huntley Brinkley Show back in the 60s, so he ran all over the world as a journalist. My father has over 400 publications, 40 books. He's an archaeologist and was one of the top in his field. I went to some of the best schools. I was also asked to leave some of the best schools in the United States. So again, I didn't come from what most stereotypically, we think of with addiction. I'm going to take her off now. So at 21 years old, I found myself in treatment. And I was 21, and I ended up at a facility, it was 1982, where they treated mostly addicted physicians. And I got there, I was younger than anyone else. I wasn't a physician. And I felt really out of place. But after about 3 weeks in, and this is the power of brain chemistry clearing, after about 3 weeks in, I realized that if I didn't change my life, if I didn't get sober, I was going to die, or at least have a miserable existence on the way to death. And that was my aha moment. I was in treatment for about 4 or 5 months, got out and went back to school. Now, when I was at University of Georgia, going to the wrong class. That class I went to, he added me, and I ended up getting a D in it and an F in the one that I didn't go to. So I left University of Georgia. We have a grading scale where a 4 is the highest, and then there's 0. So I had a 1.19 when I left Georgia. Got sober, went to college, and graduated with a 3.9. That's the difference between a brain on drugs and a brain in recovery. So having been an addicted adolescent and studying psychology, once the lights started going off, I just knew, more than anything I ever knew in my life, that I wanted to be a counselor, that I needed to work in this field. I had a passion for it, and I still do. So I went on to graduate school, and I've had the ability to study with some of the best in the world. I've studied Ericksonian therapy. I've studied family systemic therapy. I've studied play therapy. I had a large private practice for years where I worked with ages 4 to 80. And then began doing interventions, more interventions. I did my first intervention in 86, and then around 2000, switched the focus of my practice, and now just exclusively do interventions. So I'm very grateful for my career. I feel very blessed for those I've worked with and studied under. I've probably worked with about 3,000 families. I've seen a lot of people get better, and I've seen a lot of loss. So in 2001, I ran into my county's head of our hostage negotiation and SWAT team. And he approached me and said that they had started a new model where they were bringing in a mental health person onto the team, and would I be interested? Well, I used to run from the police. So the idea that I could even go and work with the police was like unbelievable. So I said, yeah, sure, I can do that, of course. And the next thing I knew, I'd studied with the FBI. I'd studied with some of the founders and leading people in the hostage negotiation world. We work hard. We practice a lot. We get called out day and night, mostly night. We end up with a lot of barricaded gunmen, domestic disputes gone bad where someone's taken hostage, high-risk warrants, suicides, and it is extremely stressful. We had a call out, probably the worst call out that I'd ever been on, about 6 months ago, where a man, it was a domestic violence situation. He pulled a gun on his wife. She got out of the house. He was left in the home with the 11-month-old baby, and he ended up killing himself and the child. Not before I watched my guys pull that child, 11 months old, out in their arms and try and resuscitate her. It's intense. We're working with lives. We're working with humans, and it is extremely stressful. There were some incidents that happened that led to the beginning and the formulation of the negotiations practice. What happened was that we began to take a look at, was the use of force going in when you have hostages involved helpful, or did it make things worse? There were several incidents that had happened back in the 70s that really came into play. The first was a situation that happened at Attica Prison. Attica Prison is in New York. Attica Prison housed about 1,200 inmates. The tension at the prison, 1971, the tension at the prison had been mounting. And one morning, a couple of guys overtook a guard and within 15 minutes had busted down a door and taken over the whole command central of the prison. There were 1,200 inmates. They took 42 civilians and guards hostage. The situation went on for 4 days. The prisoners came together and they were asking for things like a new warden. They wanted better food. They wanted better health care. They wanted better rehabilitation. They wanted drug and alcohol treatment, freedom of religion. Those were their demands. They had a long list of demands. Now, one of the things that happens when you have a hostage situation is that it's high profile. It's stressful. Lives are involved. We're not talking about property. So with a hostage situation, you always get a lot of media and a lot of politicians involved. So the governor of New York got involved, started working, trying to negotiate, and they got nowhere because they didn't really know how to negotiate back then. So into it, 4 days later, at about 10:15 in the morning, they decided that they were just going to go tactical. Send in, swarm the prison. Within 15 minutes, we had 29 civilians killed, 49 prisoners killed, and 89 wounded. There were lawsuits that took place that didn't get settled. This happened in 1971. It did not get settled until 2000. What this incident did was it changed a lot of the reforms that we have in our prisons over in the United States. We now have negotiation teams. We have better services. But it also showed the long lingering effects of a situation where hostages are involved, poorly handled. There was a lawsuit that was settled for $12 million. The second, probably the most high-profile hostage situation, one of the most defining, were the Munich Olympics, 1972. 8 Arab terrorists invade the Olympic compound and take 11 Israeli athletes hostage. Within 10 minutes, they'd killed 2. Their demands were extreme. They wanted 200 prisoners that were housed in Israel to be transported to Egypt, and they wanted it to happen now. The Munich police stepped in and some of the authorities and started trying to negotiate with them. They said, we'll give you all the money you want. And the terrorists became inflamed and saw that as a stall tactic. And they said, we don't care about money. We don't care about our lives. And then they said, if you don't start meeting our demands, we're going to start killing athletes by the twos in the next 10 minutes. So the terrorists wanted, at that point, to be airlifted out of the Olympic compound to the airport to be put on an airplane. So they brought helicopters in, flew them to the airport. As they got to the airport, 4 of the hostage takers took several of the hostages to go over to inspect the airplane they were going to get on. And as they were walking through the airport, on the tarmac, the command was given for a sniper to fire at one of the hostages, and he missed. Immediately, the hostage took a hand grenade, popped it, threw it into the helicopter. Hostages were killed, gunfire erupted, and in 10 minutes' time, all 11 hostages were killed. 5 terrorists were killed and 1 police officer. Tragic. Y'all will love this. Y'all, I'm Southern. I'm from the southern part of the States. Stockholm, Sweden. The next situation really helped us define the term Stockholm Syndrome, which is a term that really describes what happens when there's a traumatic bond that can take place between hostages and their captors. And, again, when we talk about hostages, we're talking about people who don't have a choice. We're talking about individuals who someone's got power over them. They hold them captive, either physically or psychologically. So, 1973, Stockholm, in my mind, I'm thinking down the street. I was looking for it this morning on the ride over. There's a bank. And in a quiet morning routine, all of a sudden, the bank erupts with machine gun fire. And there's a lone gunman, Jan Erik Olsen, who screams out in English, "The party has just begun." Now, Jan was on furlough from prison. He didn't make it back. He had a little detour at the bank on the way there. So he came in and he took 4 hostages, 3 women and 1 man. And then went and locked himself in the vault for 6 days. So one of the things that your law enforcement did really well, I don't know if it was already done in the front ahead of time, but you had in the vault little peepholes where you were able to look in and see what was going on and watch. So one of the things that they began to notice was that after the first day, the hostage takers, the captors, and the hostages were all on first-name basis. And then they noticed that the hostage takers were comforting the hostages. There was even a woman who was in there who was very claustrophobic. And she, they let her go on a walk. They took this rope and tied it around her and let her walk out of the vault on this leash. And later she reported that she thought that their captors were so kind to have let her go on this walk on the leash out of there. Within the 3rd day, they realized that they were able to talk to the hostages, and the hostages were telling the police that they were more afraid of the police hurting them than they were of their captors. After 6 days, they were finally released. And they refused to testify against the hostage takers. Oh, I left a very important part out. One of his first demands was that his roommate from prison come join him. So there were 2 captors because they let that happen. So they were, they refused to testify. They were more worried that the terrorists were going to the robbers were going to get hurt than their own lives themselves. There were even rumors that they had helped raise money to pay for their defense afterwards. But what that shows us is, again, how the psychological dynamics, that trauma bond, can really begin to take place and be so very powerful between captors and their hostages. So what happened because of these and some other incidents is that New York Police Department, NYPD, came around and said, we really need to evaluate. We need to evaluate whether the use of force in hostage negotiations really is, in terrorist situations, is really helpful. And they pulled together and designed the whole field of negotiations, which has been described as the most effective, nonviolent tool that we have in law enforcement. It was developed by two men, Harvey Schlossberg, who was a PhD psychologist and a detective with the police department, and Lieutenant Frank Blotz, who was a detective. And they came together and they developed several theories, several underlying importance of the field. And they said that first off, you needed to really contain and negotiate when you had a terrorist situation. That you needed to really stop and understand the hostage taker's motivation. What was the context? Why were they acting this way? What were they trying to get out of the situation? They realized the importance of stopping and slowing things down. Because, see, they understood that when you had a situation like Munich, there were only 4 ways to go. You could either assault, you could use sniper, you could use chemical methods, agents, or you could contain and negotiate. And that containing and negotiating was the safest way to go. See, there's a theory when it comes to negotiations. There's a guiding principle. And that principle is that we have 0 acceptable losses. This is a principle that we should have in the addiction field. 0 acceptable losses from this disease. So terrorism, again, is defined as a threat to society. It is a way in which persons or groups come in and use violence, mayhem, destruction in order to frighten, scare, and shut down populations. When you have a terror attack, it changes everything. After we experienced 9/11, we've never gone through the airports in the United States the same way ever again. As I sat in negotiation school, learning about the principles, understanding, I suddenly couldn't stop looking at the correlation, looking at the principles, and how, I felt like we were talking about addiction. When you have an addiction in a family, you lose a loved one, it changes everything about how you feel, how you look at the world, in the same way that a terror attack does. We talked about how a terrorist had power over the hostages, and yet addiction has power over an addict, their families, our communities, our brain chemistry. We talked about how terrorists get this trauma bond with their captors, and then I'm thinking about what happens with addiction in a family and our loved one, and we call it enabling. But isn't it really Stockholm Syndrome? Where we have to come in and help families who are also terrorized because they're watching their loved ones die slowly or rapidly from drugs and alcohol. To come in and teach those families, here's how you support health, not demise. When you have a terror attack, you stop and you wait and you're wondering, when is it going to happen again? It's looming. And when you have addiction in your family tree or in your community or in your neighborhood, it looms like sleeper cells in our own homes. And suddenly I began to realize that we're under attack and that our biggest terrorist is addiction. And in the United States, we have, in our high schools, in our schools, our elementary schools, we have tornado drills, we have fire drills. In 2018, we have terrorist drills, sadly. But we don't do addiction drills in our school, and addiction is far more likely to kill our kids than a tornado, than Ebola, than the Zika virus, or a fire. In fact, in the United States, you should see how freaked out we get. You get a jalapeno pepper that has salmonella in it, and it gets all over the news, and everybody goes crazy, and you go into the grocery stores, and they've ripped every pepper off of the shelf. Everybody goes home, yanks the peppers out of their refrigerator. Nobody wants to eat that pepper and die, and yet we're losing 180 people a day in the States to opiate overdose death, and the peppers get more attention than our dying addicts. This was there's an amazing woman in the United States named Christine Stapleton. She's a journalist, and she took a small area and took every death that had happened and gave it a name and a face and wrote an article and published it. This is off the front page of her, the article that she did. Because we are under attack. In the United States, between 2001 and 2014, we lost 3,043 people to terror attacks. That includes 9/11. Between 2001 and 2014, we lost almost 500,000 people just to overdose. That is half the size of Stockholm. That would be like going outside and half the city got wiped out. Our nation, we have 23.5 million active addicts in the United States. When I gave this talk a year ago, we were losing 91 people a day to opiate overdose. That was in March. Today, the stats are at 170 to 180 a day just from opiate death. And the average first age of drug use in the United States is 12. That's average. So that means some start younger, some start a little older, but I can tell you I see more starting at 8, 9 with their parents. In the U.S., 2,500 children a day under the age of 18 will take a prescription pill out of their parents' or their friend's parents' medicine chest to get high. Of those 2,500 kids a day, 60% are 15 or younger. And that's just opiates. Alcohol, we lose alcohol we know is connected with violent crimes, rape, sexual assault, death. And the other thing that we know in the States is that most of our deaths don't get recorded the right way. So if someone's drunk and they fall down and they crack their head open, the death certificate will read blunt force trauma to the head, not that they died of alcoholism. Sadly, in the U.S., we're 4.6% of the world's population. We use 80% of the world's opiates and 2/3 of the world's illegal drugs. We are under attack. And that's just the people using. 1 in 4 of our children have someone in their family tree who's addicted. Now, bear with me, because I have some Swedish stats too. Yeah. Here in Sweden, since 1995, your addiction rate has increased by 770%. You are 4 times higher than the European average when it comes to having addiction and addiction deaths here in your country. You have had you went from like 20 deaths a year to like 609 deaths a year. 507 of those were opiate overdose deaths. Again, these are the ones that are reported properly. And you guys, since 1988, have had a zero tolerance level for drugs and alcohol, right? Which has made stigma a little more difficult, I believe. Not judging. Heroin, methamphetamine, marijuana are huge here. And again, your stats compared to the rest of Europe are high. So you're under attack too. Yeah. This is Connor Eckhart. I did Connor's intervention. He had been sober about 8.5 months. He was in a sober living house in California. And some kids said to him, let's go out and let's smoke some marijuana. He said, I can't because I get drug tested. So he, his friends said, well, there's this stuff called spice. It's a synthetic marijuana. It won't show up in your drug test. He took one hit and never came back. Went into a coma. His organs were harvested. His parents have been active advocates since his loss. What I say about this picture is that no parent should ever have to go through this. Ever. And yet, our parents are going through it in the groves every day. It is painful. We are under attack. And again, I stop and I ask, like, why are we more terrified of ISIS than we are of this? This is painful. This is unacceptable. So I stopped and I asked myself, why is that? Why are we so afraid to talk about addiction? I mean, again, if we thought there was a sleeper cell down the street, we'd be down there. And yet we have sleeper cells, in our own homes from this addiction terrorist. And yet we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to deal with it head on. Why? So I stopped and I said, well, maybe it's our ideology. We come from a very chemical culture. In the U.S., if you have a headache, you take a pill. And in fact, don't just take a pill, take an extra strength pill, and that will make your headache go away better. And if you think you might even get a headache, go ahead and take a pill just to make sure that you don't. If you're out having a good time, drink a beer, have some vodka. You'll have more fun. You'll be funnier. You'll be sexier. It'll be more exciting. If you have a good time, you have to add to it, right? In the United States, we have a morning television show. And on that show, comes on at 10 o'clock in the morning, like right now. And on that show, the hosts always have glasses of wine on the table. And I go, what? What are they doing? And you know what? I look at that and I say to myself, they have no idea what it's like to be a late-stage alcoholic. Because morning drinking is not sexy. If you've ever seen someone drink in the morning because they have to, do you know what it looks like? It looks like this. It looks like I can't hold the glass because I'm shaking so much. It looks like someone doing everything they can to get that glass up to their lips where they take that sip and it goes down and it comes back up. And it goes down again and it comes back up. It mixes with bile and then it goes back down and then they go, okay. It's not sexy. And can you imagine if we took, that was my water. Can you imagine if we took the symptoms of any other illness in the late stages and glorified it If we said, look at our leukemia patients or our cancer patients in late stage and here's their symptoms and let's put it on TV, we'd be absolutely outraged. So I think we have to stop and look, what's our ideology around chemicals? What are we saying? What are we propagating? And, we also have to stop and say, is it the stigma? I mean, is it what we think addiction is? I mean, we often think addiction is someone who's homeless or someone who lives on the streets or someone who's not able to function. Stigma comes in. This is the only disease that we have where people don't want to have it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to accept it. And we want to look at it, again, like it's one population. We don't want to see that it's our honor students, it's our athletes, it's our pilots, it's our lawyers, it's our attorneys, it's our mother, it's your grandfather. That's what addiction looks like. I had a mom that I worked with whose son had had a psychotic break from the marijuana he was using. He was 20. He was in a psychiatric hospital for about 3 months before we started to begin to get him back. Finally, he started to normalize, come out of his psychosis. He'd been smoking since he was young. We had a big meeting with the family, and the doctors were there, the team were there, I was there, and they said, the good news is he's here and he's back. His brain chemistry is very fragile. He cannot pour chemicals on his brain ever again, or he may go into a psychosis that he won't come back from. And the mother began to weep. And then she said, do you mean he can't drink ever? And I thought to myself, first I got a little judgmental about it. I thought, are you kidding me? But then I realized in her mind, like that was such a loss. Or maybe in her mind, it's so scary to know that your child has this illness, that it's beyond the ability to really conceptualize, to accept. So rather than being grateful, that was the focus, that her child was going to be abnormal. He wasn't going to have a normal university experience because he couldn't drink. But that's stigma, that if you have this illness, there must be something wrong with you. You can't look like this. I started my career working at a facility where we treated primarily addicted physicians. And I learned a lot from those doctors. Now see, even though I was an addict myself, I didn't think that addiction looked like the surgeon, the cardiologist. And here was a group of smart, driven, highly functional individuals who were addicted. I will never forget my first client. He was a doctor from Montana. He was a neurologist, a neurosurgeon. And the reason he had gotten into treatment was because he was also an IV Demerol addict. So he had gone into the hospital, shot up, went into surgery, operated on Miss Jones. No one in the operating room knew he was impaired. He left. Then he came back 4 hours later and said, okay, I'm ready to operate on Miss Jones. And aghast, the surgical team said, you already operated on Miss Jones. Miss Jones was okay, and he was in treatment the next day. But it helped me to see that addiction looks like some of our finest cardiac surgeons. It looks like some of the highest functioning individuals we have out there. It's not homeless. In fact, the heroin epidemic in the United States has helped hold a mirror up to our affluent society because it is killing our honor students. I had a mother who was a physician whose son I worked with. We put him in treatment at 14 years old. Dad didn't want him to be an addict and pulled him out of treatment and brought him home. On his 15th birthday, Mom, who's a physician, goes home. Her son is dead, overdosed. His drug dealer, who is 17 years old, is there unresponsive. Mother resuscitates the drug dealer and can't save her own son. There are no words to comfort these kinds of losses. And yet we should be holding vigil until this terrorist is out of our lives. We should be standing on the streets, on the churches, because it has come in and it has affected everything. It's changed our first responders, our communities, our places of worship. And yet, why aren't we? Part of what I think and wonder with it too is it that we just don't want it to be. We don't want it to be our kids. We want it to be anybody else's kids. We don't want it to be in our communities. I mean, there's some parents who have gone through so much in their lifetime. Like when we work with families, we always do genograms. And you look at that genogram, and often we'll have a family member, a mother, for example, who's had an addicted parent herself. So she spends the majority of her life growing up with addiction, goes and raises her own family, and here it comes again. It's just too much to bear sometimes. And perhaps that's part of what gets in the way. Part of what says, not my kid. I don't want it. The other thing that I think happens is that we step back and we say, we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to deal with it as a medical issue. It's complicated. It's, the signs and symptoms of addiction aren't pretty. We lie. We break promises. We break the law. We tell you we're going to do things. We don't show up. I mean, it can be pretty bad. So in a lot of places, we've said, let's let law enforcement deal with it. In the United States, we passed a law back in 1914. We used to look at it as a disease. And then we passed a law, the Harrison Act, making it illegal to treat addiction with addictive substances. So law enforcement took over. We just threw our addicts into prison in the groves. And if throwing addicts into prison worked, everybody be coming over to the U.S. to get better, because we're really good at that. The other thing I wonder is, have we not really come in and helped educate? Have we not taught society, this is what it looks like? These are the signs of symptoms, because we've been ashamed of it. Have we not come in and said, here's what you do. Here's what it looks like. And the other thing I go back and ask is is it really that it's just the fact that maybe stigma's another terrorist? Maybe stigma's like that gunman up in the tower on the university holding everyone hostage, because we don't want to step out against it. And, often if we do, people will come in and say, maybe there's something wrong with me. If I really admit that my kids are addicted, maybe I was a bad mom. Maybe I didn't do something right, and it's just too painful. So, the other thing that I think that has come into play has a lot to do with perception. We don't even really know sometimes, what is it? What is the problem? Who is the terrorist? We know addiction comes in and hijacks the brain. It hijacks the dopamine system of the brain. We know because of that people who are addicted, like I said a minute ago, can have some of the most horrific symptoms. People I've worked with over the years who are addicted are some of the most sensitive, caring, bright, creative individuals. And yet we know when you're in active addiction, you do not have access to those assets. We look like liars. We look like cheats. We look like, So what is the problem? And then we know that the families are affected. We know that the families come in and their brain chemistry is affected too. So you have parents that are literally doing things that aren't who they really are, under the guise of helping because they're stressed and they have post-traumatic stress disorder too. And one of the things that we've done is we've been horrible to our parents. I mean, let's get frank. Psychology has been pretty bad to families. We have pathologized the mothers with, schizophrenogenic mothers. I mean, historically, we've come in and made it the parents' fault. So now, a family will come into my office, and the worst thing you can call a mother is an enabler. They will hold their head in their hands and say, I am terrible, I'm an enabler. We have pathologized families. Rather than come in and said, you are under an extreme emotional stress. But in fact, your denial, your enabling can also be looked at as fierce protection. You love your family members. You don't want them to hurt. You don't want them to suffer. And it's our job to teach families that it's just that the things that you normally, naturally do with someone who's struggling and in pain backfires when addiction's there, because addiction doesn't play by the rules. So we have to come in and teach our families how to support health, not demise. Not call them names like enablers and tell them, now look what you did. I had a mother whose son was on cocaine, and she went and sat. He was held up in a hotel room. She got a rental car, put on a wig, and sat in the parking lot for 3 days. Because in her mind, somehow, she was going to keep him safe and stay undercover. The same mom went and bought drugs for her son because she somehow believed in that moment that it was safer for her to go buy the drugs than for him to do it, and she was protecting him. That's how off family members' brain chemistry gets as well. Okay. That was my feelings. So, addiction cannot cause so much fear that we are simply resigned to its existence. We can't let it. We have to be proactive in this war. We would not sit here and let a hostage terrorist situation take place down the street and go, well, I hope it works out okay. Good luck. We have got to step up. We have got to fight this battle. Here's the good news. And part of the good news is that we have got to share the hope. Because the other thing that we see on the media is all the doom and gloom and death. 23.5 million Americans in active addiction. But guess what? Guess what? I can't click. Today, in 2018, we know more about addiction than we've ever known. We know the specific parts of the brain. We just saw them up on the screen. Thank you. We have evidence-based, proven treatment. We have 23 million Americans in recovery. Yeah, that's amazing. In fact, we have so many Americans in recovery that we have almost 200 universities that have what's called a collegiate recovery campus. And that means that you got sober as a teen and you've been sober anywhere from 6 months to a year, and you go off to university and there's a whole setup. You're going to hear from someone later today from Texas Tech, hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit. You've got sober support right there for our addicts who want to go back to college, back and learn. That's incredible. We have got to change our ideologies and propagate the truth. We have got to increase awareness and understanding. We have got to teach families. We've got to teach society. We've got to teach our communities, our places of worship, what this illness looks like, and give them the hope. We cannot pretend any longer that it's not happening in our homes or in our schools or in our places of worship. And I can tell you still today, I can probably walk into just about any school in the United States and they will tell me that it's not in their school that they have a drug problem. And sadly, for us, the opiate epidemic is proving them wrong. These conversations have got to begin at home. They've got to take place around the dining room table. Our families have got to learn how to talk about this and share it with their loved ones. They've got to know that if their children get in trouble, that there's help out there. But that also means that our parents have got to take a look at their relationship with chemicals too. I mean, 1 in 4 of our children have an addicted individual in their life, in their family. And our kids have got to know that if you begin to get in trouble, there's help available, and it is not a disgrace to get help. It's not a disgrace, it's not a sign of weakness, and it does not mean your life is over. And the more we share, the more we decrease the stigma, and the more we support each other. I had a mother on her way to do an intervention. She was meeting me in another part of the country where her son was living, and she got a fraud alert on her credit card. So she calls the bank, and she's on the